So you just bought a new carburetor, you're ready to drop it in and get going, but how do you do the initial setup so you can start driving and begin the tuning process? Well, I'll show you that today. Before we move out to the truck and talk about the setup process, there's a couple of things we need to cover first. And really, the big key thing is, what is tuning? Tuning is the calibration of a universal, in this case, carburetor, to an application that is unknown to the carburetor, and the two must be synced up so they operate properly together. Now, that sounds like a really complicated deal, and it is a little bit more difficult, but fortunately, two things. One, these carburetors are very easy to tune, but also Edelbrock gives you the entire cheat sheet on how to do this. But before we get started on that, before you even begin to turn a wrench, there's some things that you have to do to make sure that the carburetor is ready to accept the engine that it's going on, and that the carburetor will have the support that it needs to get the job done. So let's quickly talk about those. Now, this is the carburetor that came off the engine. I had it on there for a different reason, to do a little bit of other testing. I will show you that in a different video, but essentially the same is going to happen whether it was this carburetor or it was a brand new carburetor like we're about to install on there in a minute. Now, before we jump out there, let's talk about some of the tools that you need to do this properly. The first is a timing light, and I know that sounds kind of funky because we're talking about a carburetor and working on a fuel system, but timing is the number one issue that most people have when swapping into a new carburetor or working on a new install and trying to figure out why the carburetor doesn't run right. The ignition system and ignition timing is one of the most neglected things when it comes to figuring out why a carburetor is or isn't running the way it should. And it's one of the first questions that you'll see that I ask when people have tech questions about a carburetor issue that they're having. What is your initial timing set at? Where are you set at initially on your timing, and what's the all-in? Those are critical to know, because if you answer, well, yeah, it's set right, give me a number. I need to know the number. Typically, on an engine, small block Chevy like I'm working on here, now I'm fairly close to sea level. We're about 400 foot above sea level, if I remember correctly. And I start all of my engines at around 12 to 14 degrees before top dead center. Now, if you look back at the original spec for that small block that came in my 71 GMC truck, it's probably 6 to 8 degrees before top dead center is where the factory set it at. And if that's where you've got your timing set at, I am telling you it's not enough. Today's fuel, because it has ethanol in it, it's a little bit lesser quality than I think it probably was in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, whatever you want to look at. And there's no lead in the fuel either. So you need a little bit more timing to start the burning process a little bit sooner. Timing fixes a lot of issues when you come to these carburetors. So that is a big part of the initial setup, is make sure you get the timing right. The next thing you're going to need is a good vacuum gauge. Now, when we do set the initial idle mixture screws and get all those dialed in, you're going to have both. This timing light has a tack on it, so I use it under hood instead of trying to go back and forth from the truck to read the tachometer, see what the engine RPM is. It's nice to have them both underneath hood. Do whatever is best for you. For me, this works out well because I don't have to go anywhere. I can look at the RPM, see what the gauge is reading for as far as vacuum, and then side idle mixture screws. Now, I did a really long 20-minute video on how to set idle mixture screws already. I will link that. We're not going to go through that step by step today, but it is certainly the process that we're going to work on. And if you want a more detailed video, you can go check that one out. And the last thing, well, I don't want to jinx you, but have a fire extinguisher handy. Yeah, I understand, but you're working with fuel. You're working with in a situation where you're using a brand new carburetor. You don't know the situation. You are removing and reattaching fuel lines. You could have a leak somewhere. The last thing that you want to do is get into trouble and burn the whole thing down. So play it safe. Have a fire extinguisher close by. I don't want to try to jinx you with it, but for sure, fortunately, a couple of times in my life, having a fire extinguisher close by has saved a vehicle and maybe saved a lot more. So just have one close by. It won't hurt you. The last thing you need to have is a calibration kit. Now, we're not going to talk about the actual tuning. This is just the initial setup of the carburetor, but you will need some pieces out of your calibration kit. So go ahead and order one now for the carburetor part number that you're working with, and that way you'll have the parts that you need to get this job done. So now that we got all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get the carburetor installed on the engine, and we'll start talking about the initial setup. So let's move out to the truck and we'll show you what's next. Initially, we're ready to go. So carburetor's bolted on. I'm not going to bore you with that. You guys have seen that 1,000 times. Everything is hooked up. Now, I always run timed vacuum or ported vacuum on anything that's really stock, and this is a fairly mild cam. It's a little bit more aggressive, but we are going to try it in the ported or timed spot. For now, it's unhooked, distributor's unhooked, and I have my vacuum gauge hooked to full manifold vacuum. That's what we want. A big part of this, and again, a lot of the reasons why people fail, is getting the fuel system set up right. Now, that is a brand new Edelbrock pump, something I decided to change and upgrade to. Puts out a little bit more pressure than the stock pump, but it's rated between, I think, 5 and 7 psi. Doesn't matter. I don't want you to get hung up on that. I don't care if it says it's rated from 3 to 6 or it's only rated at 6 psi. It's fixed. Doesn't matter. You always, 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 always should run a pressure regulator. Doesn't matter what carburetor you're working on. Doesn't matter what the pump is set at. Always run that regulator. Give yourself one more adjustability point in a system that doesn't have a lot. You've heard me talk about regulators a lot over the years, and you'd see it eventually if you do this on your own and you find a situation where you're pushing too much fuel through the carburetor, and then you realize, oh, I should probably get a regulator. Well, regulator is there to regulate flow. Pressure is a byproduct of that. So if you want to watch that video, I'll leave a link to that one as well too, but don't forget the regulator. Always run one. It's just an automatic. When you buy a carburetor, you need to have a regulator with it. Just keep that on your radar. So fuel system is very critical. Now I'm using the brand new Russell Pro Filter 2 on here. I'm using this in a little bit different fashion. Typically I have this mounted on the frame rail normally, but I want this in an easier access point because I'm going to do some testing on how good a filter that is. We've already pressure tested and found out these are do remarkably well for pressure drop, but the filter always goes before the regulator. The regulator is the last thing that the engine sees. So again, I've done videos on how to set up a fuel system on my website. I've got downloads if you want to download a PDF of how I run a fuel system, but it is the best way to do it. The last thing the carburetor should see is a pressure regulator. Everything's filtered before that, so you're in good shape. Now I've got 2 filters on here. That's a 10 micron filter, so it's a little smaller. Again, running it for a test, but you can run a 40 micron. That's typically the more popular one. And then before the pump, I've got 100 micron as well, just to catch the big stuff. So that's the critical things, getting the fuel system set up right, make sure your ignition timing is well, then you can get started. Now this is a brand new carburetor, so what I didn't show you is before I installed it on here, I took the top off just to make sure and reset the floats. As these travel around, bounce around through the carrier, UPS, FedEx, however it gets delivered to your home, doesn't matter. When it's set at the factory, it can change the float setting depending on how badly your freight carrier took care of your carburetor on the way in. So first thing is always to set the floats. Just re-verify that. Doesn't take that long. Gives you the opportunity to get in there and get working. Now because this is a new carburetor and we've never monkeyed with it before, you do need to prime it with a little bit of fuel. Now what I typically do is I'll fill up a little squirt bottle full of a little fuel, and then what you can do is fill up through the vent holes right here. You can fill up the bowls with fuel. Be careful with it. You don't want to overfill them, and you don't want to dump a lot of fuel down there. I know it's really popular. You've seen about 1,000 videos, but just a couple of drops down there is all you need. I've already pre-filled these, and then all we're going to do is I'll drop a few drops down in there, and what we're going to do is check for leaks once we get started up, start looking at the vacuum, and then we can determine what step-up springs we're going to use. That's going to be our first step here in setting the initial setup of this carburetor, is to get the step-up springs right based on how much engine vacuum this thing produces. All right, runs pretty good right out of the box, but idle mixture screws need a little bit of adjustment. We set the idle mixture speed, verified timing, verified it a couple of different times. We've got about the speed that I wanted. I wanted this one to idle about 850 to 900 in park, and that's where we're at now. So it's kind of where I want to drop it down into drive. It's idles around 700, which is a little aggressive, but till we get the engine broken in, I'm going to be pretty happy with it, because it could loosen up just a little bit, and we'll have to go through this whole process again, really, especially on the tuning side of things. So now that we've got the vacuum where we wanted to, where it idles good, we need to make a step-up spring change. So the 1905, I know, comes with the orange spring in it. And if you see, that's rated at a 5-inch spring. Double it means it's around 10. That's a really good average spring to use, but I'm going to follow the way that the tuning chart works, and I'm going to follow it by the book. We'll see how well we can tune it. The plain springs are the 8-inch springs, which will put us up to an opening of the main metering circuit, or full fuel flow, at around 16 psi of pressure. When the manifold pressure starts to drop from 20 down to 19, 18, 16, and then it will release that spring, open it up. It is to help you transition from a more leaner condition, less fuel, into more wide open throttle, or into more throttle position that's a little bit more open. And when you meter through the main metering circuit, the rods and jets and the step-up springs help do that. So this is another step in your initial setup of this carburetor. We're just talking about the basics here. We still haven't done any tuning at all. This is just setup. So let's go get those silver springs in. And there's the orange spring that we're going to replace. And the plain spring is going in. One last little detail is the fast idle speed. Now, this is an electric choke carburetor. Obviously, we're on a mechanical choke on the engine now, so it didn't really cover too much of it. But obviously, if you're an electric choke carburetor, setting the choke is part of the initial setup and the fast idle speed. So same thing with anything else, just make sure the choke is set completely. That way you can get up on the that adjustment pretty easy. Better to do when the engine's cold, not when it's running, but something we didn't talk about, but figured need to throw that in there. And that's it, you're set. Initially, this carburetor is set up to begin driving and start tuning. Now, we are nowhere near tuned for this engine, but what we are ready to do is to start that process. So, idle mixture screws, idle speed, step-up springs, ignition timing, all parts of the initial setup. So don't get it confused. If you've done those things, great, you're ready to start tuning, but you have not tuned that carburetor yet. That is an untuned carburetor, it has no idea what it's working on. All it does know is what kind of engine vacuum we're drawing and what the idle mixture screws need to be set up. So we're good to go. We're ready to begin the process. So if you got any questions on this one, don't hesitate, leave them down below. Be happy to answer them for you. But don't get it confused. Initial and tuning are two different things. That's the next video in this series, is we will do the actual tuning with this. We'll do it two different ways. We'll do it one, seat of the pants style, where we don't use any other tools other than what we have available to us. And the second one, we'll use an AFR gauge to see how things worked out and see, based on what the exhaust is reading and what the engine is burning, where we're at. So anyway, leave your questions down below. Be happy to answer them. Get busy, start getting your carburetor set up initially, and then we'll start tuning.